What's up? You're listening to Beats by Jer, and I'm your host, Jared Harris. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by the venerable Rob Bowman. Rob is an absolute wealth of information and is among the coolest, most interesting, and most informative people I have the privilege of knowing. Having started his career as a journalist, Rob eventually became a professor, pioneering an academic approach to understanding popular music. Since then, Rob has written numerous books, including Stax, Soulsville U.S.A., The Last Soul Company, The Malaco Record Story, and has gone on to write hundreds of liner notes for albums. Between this and producing numerous compilation collections, Rob has won a Grammy among 6 nominations. In addition to this, he has worked with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and I am confident that I am only scratching the surface here. I first met Rob in 2016 when I took his class at York University, African American Popular Music, in which he explored spirituals, gospel, the blues, rock, jazz, pop, and hip hop through the lens of social and cultural factors as a means of better understanding the continued quest for survival, respect, dignity, and equal citizenship among Black communities and culture. This course was life-changing. It forever shifted the way in which I looked at music and culture and greatly inspired the tone and direction of this podcast. I would go as far to say that Rob's class was the main inspiration behind what Beats by Jer is and what I strive to do long before I ever even considered making a podcast. This year, Rob has produced a pair of documentaries. Stax, Soulsville U.S.A., and Any Other Way, the Jackie Shane story. While the latter will be released this fall, the former of which is currently streaming via HBO and Crave. Stax, Soulsville U.S.A. is a 4-part documentary series which traces the rise and fall of a label and sound that would become synonymous with soul music through the creative output from artists such as Otis Redding, Booker T and the MGs, the Staple Singers, Sam and Dave, and Isaac Hayes, among so many more. In addition to being co-produced by Rob and based on his book of the same name, Stax Soulsville U.S.A. not only features him in conversation, but pulls from archival footage of interviews Rob had conducted in the past, making this an exceptionally important series that stands as a culmination of nearly 4 decades of work and passion. Here's my conversation with Rob Bowman. Rob Bowman, you are live on Beats by Jer. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jared. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. So you've been incredibly busy. You live an incredibly busy life doing an abundance of cool things. Currently, you have one documentary produced in partnership with HBO, Stax Soulsville USA, that has just dropped. And you are working on another one that is set to come out later this year, Any Other Way, the Jackie Shane story. Before we get into your most recent work, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I could go on forever, but I don't think the listeners are going to want that. Um, my whole world starts when I'm 7, hearing the Beatles. It changes absolutely everything. I become obsessed with them, with music. A year later, the Stones. A year later, Bob Dylan. And when I was 10, I bought my first black record, Otis Redding's Try a Little Tenderness. And I bought it because the Rolling Stones had recorded an incredible song that they covered from Otis called That's How Strong My Love Is. And I remember Mick Jagger talking about Otis Redding and how amazing he was. So went to my local record store. They didn't have That's How Strong My Love Is, but they did have Try a Little Tenderness. Took that home, put that needle on, and suddenly whole other worlds of sound, excitement, culture opened up to me. And, it just kept going. By the time I was 12, I was literally going downtown to a club called the Colonial on Young Street. The Colonial was great because downstairs you had to be 21 or over, but upstairs there's a restaurant license. So I could get in there as a 12 and 13-year-old and they had a cutout upstairs you could see directly onto the stage. So I was seeing Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, lots of incredible blues and jazz musicians, Charles Mingus, Roseanne Roland Kirk, Ornette Coleman. Uh, and then when I was 15, it's a long story, which I'll leave out this time. Um, I got a job writing for a magazine. I was right place, right time. I had chutzpah, lied about my age. Told when asked how old I was, I said 18, even though I was 15. They asked me to review a few current albums and write a review of Frank Zappa's new movie, 200 Motels. And I went crazy. The opportunity to write for a rock and roll magazine and get free records, free concert tickets, get to interview people I adored. This was like a gift from heaven. I ended up writing a 25-page review of 200 Motels. You can tell how naive I was. Nobody in the world was going to publish a review that long, but they were impressed. Impressed that I would work that hard, impressed I knew as much as I did, even though I was only 15, and I got the gig. So my first interview was literally done at the Colonial Tavern. It was T-Bone Walker. Second one was John
Wow.
Lee Hooker before he became famous for the second time. And by the time I was 16, I had my first cover story interviewing David Gilmour of Pink Floyd on the Dark Side of the Moon tour. Take a day off high school and then come back the next day and have kids ask you, what were you doing yesterday? Where were you? Oh, I was interviewing Pink Floyd. That's cultural capital. It's pretty funny. It was great. I began interviewing so many of my heroes, and I'd already been buying records like a maniac. In fact, I was working 4 jobs just to get record money. And now suddenly I was also getting free records. I could get into more shows. Uh, it was amazing. And I kept doing this, interviewed lots of people in those early days. There's a story of Frank Zappa calling me from LA. You're hearing my dog in the background, which I apologize.
Oh, that's okay.
Frank Zappa was calling me, and I had in my mind it was 5 o'clock. I don't know if he got it wrong, I got it wrong, his publicist got it wrong, or my magazine. But either way, he was calling earlier. I wasn't home. I went to school during the day and then hanging out with some friends. I knew I had to be home at 5. I was ready to do the interview. So I come strolling home maybe quarter to 5. My mom's on the porch yelling, Frank Zappa's been calling. Frank Zappa's been calling. Where have you been? Anyway, it worked out. He called me back. Um, interviewed Santana. I think I mentioned Jeff Beck, Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane. Lots and lots and lots of my heroes. By the time I was 20, I spent 3 days with Bob Marley and the Wailers, which was really quite incredible. Anyway, it's gone on. I did a BA, then an MA in music, eventually a PhD. But before I even completed my MA, I started the first course in Canada on popular music at York University. And it was amazing. I got this gig and I got one at Brock the same year. When I was 22, did not have an MA yet, completed it later that year. Uh, and then went on to do my PhD, came back and got a full-time tenure track position and taught the first course in African American music at a Canadian university and the first graduate courses on popular music. So and I've continued, of course, writing, doing interviews. The CD revolution created a space for writing incredibly long, detailed liner notes. Uh, I've done over 300 sets of liner notes. Many of those CD sets I've produced or co-produced, nominated for 6 Grammys, won one. And these liner notes are often 20 to 45 or 46,000 words. These are based on original research, dozens and sometimes, many dozen interviews. These are deep-seated research. They're not little fluff pieces like you used to see in the back of album jackets before the CD world opened this space. And when I started, the biggest box set on popular music was Eric Clapton's 4 CD Crossroads box. Uh, I did a 9 CD box set, which was the first of 3 box sets on Stax records that were 9, 9, and 10 CDs respectively. And at the same time, I was running a book on Stax Records. That book came out many years ago now, late 90s, um, won two of the three American Music Book Awards, was inducted in the Blues Hall of Fame, led to the building of the Stax Museum of American Soul Music, which is in Memphis, which I was intimately involved in creating, and led to a film in France, and has now led to this 4-hour documentary that's on HBO in the States and Crave in Canada. So it's been a long journey. Work I started literally 40 years ago has manifested in a lot of different ways: dissertation, book, articles, dozens of liner notes, I think over 75 actually, uh, Grammy win, other Grammy nominations, a museum, a movie, and now a 4-hour documentary on. So it's been incredibly satisfying. And along the way, oh, this is an interesting thing I should mention. I mentioned I got turned on to black music and Otis Redding, which of course recorded for Stax Records by the Rolling Stones. Well, when my
Hmm.
book came out, Keith Richards bought a copy and he fell in love with it. And when Keith reads a book, it's amazing. Everybody's got this idea of Keith as sort of drunk and drugged pirate, but he's an amazingly intelligent man who only reads nonfiction. And he reads in the way where he puts yellow post-it notes on tons of pages with little notes to himself. When I saw his copy of my book, it might have had 150 post-it notes in it. He had read it so thoroughly. Anyway, because of that, when the Stones wanted to hire somebody to go on the road with them and interview them about their music, not about sex and drugs, lots of people had written about that stuff. They wanted people to talk to them about their art, which is their music, and in Mick Jagger's case, also his dancing and performance as a frontman. And so I was with them in California for a week, Australia for 2 weeks, and it was amazing. I'd be sitting on a couch with Keith, he would have his guitar, and I'd be asking him questions and he'd be showing me things on the guitar. And I'm having an out of body experience where I'm fascinated by what Keith is doing, but seeing myself as a kid at the foot of the stage going maniacal watching my heroes, the Stones. And I thought, if Keith could see that, it's such a disconnect from here I am, this competent professional that he is sought out. And I had a great time and became reasonably close with Charlie Watts. So subsequent tours, I'd always go backstage and see Charlie and remain friendly with Mick and Keith and Ronnie. It's an amazing experience and a full circle experience from being turned on to Stax as a 10-year-old by them. So
Wow.
there's dozens of other things. I've done tons of documentaries. I've worked for the United Nations in Jamaica, Trinidad, and Antigua, helping with local musical projects. Um, I've lectured around the world: Africa, Japan, Australia, South America, Mexico, Europe, North America, of course. It's been a rollicking, rocking life. And I am so grateful that I followed my dreams and have gotten to do what I love to do and created in Canada the study of popular music at an academic level. I think 13 of my former PhD students are now professors in this country teaching popular
Wow,
music.
there is so much there. You weren't kidding when you said that that could have been an episode. And there's so many things I want to ask you about, so many things I want to discuss. Um, I think I'll just touch on a few of them just so that way we can talk about the documentary because that's what we're here for.
Sure.
Um, but I mean, on the note of the Stones, I remember the first day that I took your class, I was early, which was odd for me. And I think I was wearing a Keith Richards t-shirt, and you looked at it and you said, "That's my friend," and then you just like casually turned away, opened the door, and walked in and got your notes ready. And I like just on that was like, "Wait, what? Like, there's no way he's talking about like." Keith Richards on my like, and sure enough, you absolutely were. Um, so
I've been
you
very lucky.
curious, when was that period that you were hanging out with the Stones, following them on tour like that? And was that specifically because of your Stax Soulsville USA book?
100%. They decided they wanted to do an autobiography in their own words. It eventually came out. It's called According to the Rolling Stones, large format and not a cheap
You wrote that
book.
one with them?
I, I did all those interviews.
I had no idea. I
Yeah,
love that book.
the reason you have no idea is because the credit is in 6-point font uh, on about the fourth or fifth page, and it really bothered me because I negotiated the credit, which I got, but I never thought to argue about what point size it should be in. And they
Hmm.
also listed three other people. One of them was Dora Lowenstein, who was Prince Rupert Lowenstein's daughter. And Prince Rupert Lowenstein, for years, was the Stones' financial advisor. Dora,
Yeah.
Dora was never there for an interview. She negotiated my contract, but she
Oh.
never did an interview. Another person listed was Philip Dodd. Philip Dodd was the editor on the project and did sit in on my interviews, but he didn't ask questions. He did not do the interviews. And the third one was Andrew Lloyd Webber, if I remember correctly. And he did do one interview with Mick because they wanted him to talk to Mick about mounting spectacles, which of course he's got experience with on Broadway and in London's West End, and of course every Stones tour. Uh, Certainly since the mid 70s has been a spectacle. But every other word in that book is from my interviews. Uh,
That's
so
incredible. So
I
that's
did a
like
week,
early 2000s, if I recall then.
yeah, a week in November 2002 in Los Angeles, and then 2 weeks, February 2003 in Melbourne, Australia.
I had no idea. Wow. I read that
Oh,
book.
sorry. Sorry. I did San Francisco, then Los Angeles, and then later Melbourne. But
Wow.
altogether, it's about 3 weeks, three separate trips.
Yeah, I read that book like long, long before I ever took your class. I had no idea. Um,
Yeah, nobody else did either, except for my friends. The New York Times reviewed it, and the writer was raving and going on. Finally, they get into detail about the music. And I'm like, as I'm reading it, going, yeah. And there's one reason, because I was asking those questions. Charlie told me a funny story. When they decided to do this, they asked her office for a list of 10 people that the office could come up with they thought would be good interviewers. And then Charlie told me when they got the list, it was shit. That was his word, except for one person, which was Robert Palmer, who was dead. And Charlie laughed and said, we realized we had to take care of this because the office couldn't. And it was perfect timing. Keith was reading my book. And believe it or not, bring it to rehearsals, which, when there's downtime at rehearsals, he's sitting there reading the book. So he pops up and says, I think this guy'd be good. And there's even a funnier story to it. A friend of mine who unfortunately died during my first week with the Stones, ironically, was their age, had been a friend of theirs when they first started playing at the Crawdaddy Club in London, long before they had a record contract. He had moved here to Toronto, and I knew him because he's an art director for a lot of record labels, and I did a lot of stuff with those labels. So he was a friend with the Stones before they were famous. So he went to rehearsals every night as a friend. And he calls me and he goes, Keith is reading your book at rehearsals. I'm going, what?
I mean, that's
Then he called
crazy.
me
Yeah.
days later and goes, they're talking about hiring a writer, and I think they're going to hire you. And I'm going, have you told him you know me? And he goes, not yet. But eventually, when it got serious, he said, well, he lives in Toronto, and they're rehearsing in Toronto. And Mick says, you know him? And Clive said yes. So Mick had Clive ask me to get a copy of the book for Mick and some magazine articles, just a bunch of things to bring down to them so they could read a few more things, and so Mick could be up to speed where Keith was, and I got the gig. It was amazing.
Yeah, I can imagine. Wow.
It's like a dream
Uh,
come true.
for sure. You mentioned having written over 300 sets of liner notes, and you've won a Grammy for one of them. Which one was that?
It was for Stax Soul Singles, Volume 3, 1972 to 75, 10 CD box set. And for that one, I wrote a 47,000 word essay based on over 100 interviews. So that's
Wow.
what I went for. Uh, I've lost several other times, but it's cool even being nominated. But winning is a pretty cool thing. Jean Chrétien was our prime minister then. And believe it or not, his office was reaching out to me because Chrétien wanted to congratulate me. They wanted to set up a phone call.
Cool. So this
And
was after your book then.
um, no, believe it or not, this was before the book. I'd already done a lot of research, enough to do that box set, but I was still doing more research before I decided the book was ready to finish. Um, the book took me 12 years, but I turned over every stone there was. I went through hundreds of boxes of court records, which is mind numbing, but it's amazing the gems you'll find in terms of depositions or people literally who have passed away are being interviewed about financial details, business transactions, because the book is a musicological book. It's also a
Hmm.
sociological book, and it deals with a very innovative, independent, eventually Black business. So it sort of three things in one. And it took 12 years for me to get it all done because I'm also teaching university. I'm not working on it every day, every year, but I'm working on it, all summer when I'm off from teaching, working on it over Christmas, reading week, whenever I can. And in between, I'm doing box sets.
Yeah,
So it's
it's
just been a journey that just keeps going.
you know what? Ironically, I think that's the only book of yours that I haven't read yet.
Really,
I think so, yeah.
it's the best one. It's
It's actually next on my to read list.
a long book,
Um,
though. It's
yeah,
222,000 words. Your average
okay.
book's 90,000 words. So this is like two and a half books for the price of one.
Okay, okay. I mean, watching the documentary, I was like, it's been too long since I've actually like I've just put it off.
The
But
documentary
you
is based on the book. And the
mm-hmm.
Jackie Shane documentary, which is coming out at the end of the year, is based on my work interviewing Jackie for a two CD box set that was nominated for a Grammy. Didn't win, but I was
Mm-hmm.
nominated as a producer on that one.
I'm familiar with that one because I don't know if you remember, but I had interviewed you for the Spill magazine about the Jackie Shane project.
Oh, right.
Um,
I did a lot
yeah,
of interviews.
that was oh, I don't even remember when that was now, but um and I also remember that was I guess it was around the time that I had your class or I had seen you because you had told me about it before the interview, I think. And we kind of sat down and talked about it for a bit. Um but let's turn our attention to Stax Soulsville USA, the documentary. Um you've mentioned your love for Stax records goes way back.
Oh my God, yes.
And you said hearing Otis Redding was the first time that you heard the Stax sound, but you were about 10 years old. Were you
Absolutely.
like, how conscious were you at that very young age that you were
I should
hearing the
say,
Stax sound?
well, I should say something else. Although I didn't buy it, Wilson Pickett's In the Midnight Hour, which came out on Atlantic, but was actually recorded at Stax with the Stax house band. A little deal that Atlantic and Stax worked out. That was a big radio hit. So I did hear that a ton when I was 9 and loved it, but didn't think to buy it. Uh, but yeah, when I heard Otis Redding, it was another thing altogether. And I think within a year, I'd realized Sam and Dave were recording at the same studio. Uh, and then eventually put it together that Pickett had recorded there, Booker T and the MGs, William Bell, Eddie Floyd, Rufus Thomas, who of course had done Walking the Dog at Stax early, and the Rolling Stones had covered it. So it's a song I knew really well as a cover. Rufus later became a very close friend. In fact, I was one of the three people to speak at his funeral. It was myself, B.B. King, and the mayor of Memphis. And I
Wow.
later spoke at the celebration of life for his son, Marvell Thomas, who was a studio musician at Stax. The whole Thomas family and I were very close. He used to go to birthday parties, Christmas things. Carla Thomas and I remember singing Otis Redding duet together at one party. That's another thing. Besides getting to ask questions and have conversations with people who had been my heroes, many of them became lifelong friends.
It's incredible.
And, Rufus and Carla Thomas are among those. Anyway, so it took me a bit before I began to understand that all of this was coming out of Memphis and coming out of one studio. But I was voracious. And it wasn't just soul music. I was a voracious buyer of rock, pop, eventually jazz, country. After I saw Bob Marley, I went reggae crazy, buying up reggae, rock steady, ska, and became, extraordinarily knowledgeable about that. So I'm sort of a polyglot in terms of my interest. When I moved to Memphis to do my PhD, I had a few ideas. One was the great jug band tradition from the 20s that I would have played for you on the class you took for me on African American music. Another was the post-war gospel quartets, which were just incredible in Memphis in the late 40s, early 50s.
We're talking kind of like doo-wop stuff, right?
Well, not doo-wop, the hard gospel singers who influenced people like James Brown and Wilson Pickett. I'm talking about people like the Spirit of Memphis Quartet, who were just
okay.
mind-blowing. In fact, I produced some black gospel when I lived in Memphis. I also could have done rockabilly, the Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins stuff that came out of Sun Records. And in fact, I interviewed the Sun Rhythm section, every member, and published articles on them. But there was, of course, Stax Records, and I also could have done High Records. High was where El Green, Syl Johnson, Ann Peebles, Willie Mitchell all recorded. And it was right around the corner from Stax, and also had its own unique, very distinctive from Stax, but great sound. But the first day I moved there, emptied my U-Haul, went for dinner with a friend who'd helped me move down. We're in a pizza restaurant. Waitress, maybe 24, 25, is serving us. And she goes, "Y'all aren't from here, are you?" Of course, no. "What are you doing here?" "Going to school, do my PhD at the University of Memphis." And she goes, "Oh, what are you going to do it on?" And I mentioned what I just said to you. She goes, "What's Stax Records?" And I'm thinking, Stax closed 8 years earlier. This woman was alive in her very late teens. And in fact, her whole life, Stax had existed up to that point, and she had no clue. There were 8 books on Motown at that time, nothing on Stax. So I decided I was a man with a mission. I was in the right place. I could rectify what I saw as a real historical wrong and chronicle the Stax Record story, the community, and all that great music with as much richness and dignity as I could. And I knew it was a dissertation and thought it would be a book. I never had any idea it would spiral into the incredible numbers of projects that have happened since then. And that 40 years later, I'd still be talking about it, but here I am. And I've done a lot of work on other genres, other types of music outside of Stax, in between, tons of it. Jackie Sheehan, a good example. But whenever somebody wants something done on Stax, I'm the go-to person because I was the person who started this whole thing. And many, many, many people I interviewed have passed away. So when the Stax film documentary was going to get made, they wanted use of my interview tapes especially with people who had passed away, and that was part of the deal. I was co-executive producer, creative consultant. My book gets a full screen credit for inspiring the film. And I got a credit for using my interviews. Plus, I'm interviewed extensively on screen, as you know, since you've seen it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It's
it was a labor of love. And it was about 4 years of work.
well, it's a fantastic documentary, and it's so cool that this stemmed out of. I mean, I obviously knew you love Stax Records and the music that came out of that era and that out of Memphis, but it's really cool to hear that you love something so much, and in realizing that the people that should have known about it as well, just geographically didn't. You felt that there was a cultural injustice that, you had to do this, out
100%.
of your own love for the subject material. That's so interesting.
And the
Um,
more I began to meet people who were involved in this, oh, geez, that's my other phone. Sorry. You want me to wait and let the ringing finish? I'm
no,
going to
it's
get
okay.
into it.
I could hardly hear it on my end.
Okay. Rufus Thomas was my first interview. That was about a month after I got to Memphis. And Rufus and I became close friends, as I mentioned earlier. And through that, of course, I met his daughter, who had recorded big hits on Stax like Gee Whiz and B.A.B.Y. Baby. And Carla and I became close. Their son Marvell, I mentioned, had been a session musician. He and I became close. And it kept spiraling as I interviewed virtually everybody who was still alive in Memphis, and then started, traveling all over the South to interview people who had moved, but regionally, so they're within 2, 3, 4, 5 hours of Memphis. Then eventually was flying to New York and California for people who had moved that far. But from that very beginning, when I met Rufus, my idea that I felt somebody needed to right this historical wrong, it then became personal. I had relationships, and those relationships kept growing. And I still feel duty bound, honor bound, whatever word you might want to use, to those people and the wider community that surrounded Stax, the Black community in South Memphis. I feel a huge obligation, and will maintain that obligation till I die. Again, it doesn't mean I'm not going to work on tons of other music projects, but anytime there's room to do something that helps credit and helps the careers and helps the royalty streams for those people, I want to be there.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I mean, even myself, like I really enjoy soul music. I really enjoy Stax Records, but I want to say before watching the documentary, I certainly knew and was very familiar with most of Otis Redding's work, Isaac Hayes. Um, but like if you asked me to tell you who was on Stax and who was central to the Stax sound, like my list would kind of end there. Um, but let's talk a bit about the Stax sound. What is it to you? How would you describe, how would you define the Stax
Sure.
sound?
Well, let's first of all tell our listeners who might not know that although there's sort of a pre-labeled Stax starting in 57, the Stax story is really from 1960 to 75, 15-year period. And it divides in two really neatly. In May 68, so halfway through that 15-year period, Atlantic severed its relationship with Stax severed its relationship with Atlantic Records, who distributed it. Coincident with that, several core musicians left Stax. First of all, Stax got the whole back catalog by a quirk in the contract that should have been caught but wasn't. But the other thing is, some of the musicians like Booker T. Jones, and the MGs, which were the house band at Stax, decided to leave Memphis, move to California. So the sound from 60 to 68 was one thing. In fact, it continues really to early 69. But after that, there was no longer that identifiable sound. there was a range of different sounds. Stax really expanded the kind of artists it would sign and what it would do. So when people talk about the Stax sound, they're really talking about the first period.
Okay.
And unbelievably, in the second period, the company was even more important in terms of selling records, especially to a Black populace. That's the period when Isaac Hayes began to record his extraordinary solo albums, became known as Black Moses. His success paved the way for Marvin Gaye, Curtis Mayfield, Funkadelic, Stevie Wonder, all to record their great albums at the beginning of the 70s. When Isaac recorded Hot Buttered Soul in 69, which is far from a
Fantastic record.
sound, but it's a new sound, it's the first Black artist to sell 1 million copies of an album. Industry wisdom was that if you sold 30,000 copies of a Black album in the 60s, you had saturated the market. That proved to be very wrong. People in the industry believed that. Jerry Wexler, who co-owned Atlantic, is the person who told me that, but I've also read it later in Billboard. But Jerry said, the Black populace didn't have the money, so they bought singles, not albums. And there weren't that many African Americans who could afford albums, and white people generally didn't buy Black albums. Of course, there's lots of exceptions to what he said. A couple of artists, James Brown and Otis Redding, for example, would sell a few 100,000 copies of an album, but over many years, never close to 1 million. Isaac sold 1 million really quickly. Went to #1 in the jazz charts, the R&B charts, the pop charts, and the easy listening charts. Tell me another record that was #1 on those 4 different charts. It was an unbelievable accomplishment and woke up the whole industry to the fact that if you provided studio hours and economic resources to Black artists, the best of them, just like the best white artists, can make album length statements that are profound art and that people will buy them by the ton. So extremely important. Also in that second period were the staple singers, who of course in many ways created a subgenre we might call soul gospel, with records like I'll Take You There, Respect Yourself, Touch a Hand, Make a Friend, If You're Ready, Come Go With Me. And then there were the dramatics, What You See Is What You Get. Incredible song. The Emotions, So I Can Love You. There were so many incredible sounds, if you will, in that second period that aren't what people typically think of as the Stax sound. In the first period, virtually every record was backed up by Booker T and the MGs, often with Isaac Hayes as a second keyboard player. He wasn't a solo artist. He was a songwriter, producer, and session musician at the time. So it's Booker T and the MGs, Isaac Hayes, and the Memphis Horns. And the Memphis Horns was one trumpeter, Wayne Jackson, a tenor sax player named Andrew Love, and usually a third and occasionally a fourth member, which varied over the years. That group of people created that sound. The sound is bass heavy. The sound is sparse. Motown, the sound's really dense. It fills up the whole spectrum. And, every eighth note, there's things happening. With Stax, there's room to breathe. You don't hear background vocals in that first period on virtually any record. A couple of exceptions. Only one Otis record has background vocals ever. It recorded about 130 sides. You also don't have the typical ride pattern on the hi-hat or ride cymbal, that band of white noise that's on most pop records, either playing eighths or sixteenths or some version thereof. Al Jackson, the drummer of Booker T and the MGs, would play that live, but in the studio, didn't want that sound. And the reason is really curious. Steve Cropper, the guitarist in the MGs, told me that, excuse my cough, that they had read that women don't like high sounds. I don't think they're correct, by the way, but they had read that and believed it. And they also felt that most 45s, remember, they're not really selling albums in this first period. They felt most 45s were bought by women, or women influenced their boyfriends or husbands to buy them. So don't put that hi-hat or ride cymbal sound in those records, and they'll be more appealing to women. That was their logic. I'm not sure it's rooted in science or biology at all, but that partially accounts for that sound. Now, another thing about Stax is Southern soul music, and Stax really created the blueprint for Southern soul music. Southern soul music, in many ways, is simply gospel music with secular lyrics. In fact, I don't know what, I don't know, like, you don't know, like I know what That Woman Has Done for Me, a great hit record by Sam and Dave, written by Isaac Hayes and David Porter, was simply a rewrite of a gospel song called You Don't Know Like I Know What the Lord Has Done for Me. Stax was so different from Motown that way. There's some gospel influence in Motown, especially in the tambourines work. Motown had an incredible tambourine player. It was basically his whole job because he was so sophisticated with it. And it's coming out of the Black church. Jack Ashford was his name. But Stax, virtually all the vocalists, straight out of the church and still sang with the emotional drive for catharsis that gospel musicians sing with. That really separates out Stax. So you got its bottom heavy, you got its sparse, virtually no high end, gospel vocals, and then you've got the solos. Most solos in popular music, black or white, guitar solo for 8, 12, or 16 bars, maybe a piano solo, might be a saxophone, and improvised, if you will, although the improvisation's often worked out and memorized. At Stax, they didn't have solos like that for the most part. Instead, for the B section, the bridge, which people often wrote a different chord progression for and put lyrics on in most popular music, at Stax, that bridge was typically an instrumental bridge with the 3 horns playing a pre-arranged ensemble sound in unison, not in harmony, unison, but a big fat sound because there are 3 of them. And then at the last note might break into a 3-part chord. That was an essential part of the Stax sound. It was Otis Redding who developed that idea. Otis, although he wasn't a horn player, was so important for conceiving horn lines in his records, which influenced the horn players on every other record they recorded. And one more key thing. Popular music is generally in 4/4 time. That means there's 4 beats to a bar. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And in popular music, usually the backbeat, the 2 and the 4 accents. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And that accent's usually played by the snare drum and often a rhythm guitar or a keyboard. Well, Stax worked on a 4/4 setup. And yes, the backbeat is emphasized deeply, much more than Motown's for that matter, but it's delayed. It's fractionally delayed. It is so subtle that a lot of people can't hear it till you point it out. I put it up on the computer and had it analyzed. It's definitely there. In fact, I probably showed you a chart in the class that you took from me demonstrating
I think
it.
so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and that your body moves to the groove, whatever. Motown, Stax, Sound of Philadelphia, Mersey beat, London R&B, disco, whatever. But Stax groove was really unique because of that delayed backbeat. It's really hard to play. Most bands covering Stax records don't play it well. It's really difficult. The other thing is, when bands cover Stax recordings like Knock on Wood by Eddie Floyd, or Hold On I'm Coming by Sam and Dave, or Respect by Otis Redding, they always speed them up. They're really fast. They're energetic. They're frantic. Well, when Stax artists perform live, they did that too. But in the studio, it's actually shocking if you listen. They rarely go above mid-tempo. Those records are so much slower than lots of Motown hits. They're ballads, which are usually in 12/8 coming out of the church, and there's mid-tempo songs, not too many really up-tempo. And I mentioned the gospel influence in the vocals. This will leave people behind who are not musicians, but at Stax, you get far more 4/1 cadences in terms of chords. That's a gospel cadence. That's the all men cadence. Motown, you get 5/4/1, typical of a lot of popular music, or 2/5/1. A lot less 4/1 cadences. That
Mm-hmm.
also, even if you can't hear it because you're not a musician and don't know how to recognize it, you still are hearing it. You just don't know what to call it, but you can tell it's different. So all of those things together created the Stax sound, plus all of those records recorded in a very unique recording studio. The recording studio was in an abandoned old movie theater. Movie theaters have a sloping floor. They also are wider at the back and they get narrower towards where the screen was. If you think about it, the ceiling at the back is much shorter than the ceiling at the front because of that sloped floor. And the walls on the left and right, because they're narrowing towards the stage, are not perpendicular. There are no perpendicular sounds in that room. And what that means is any sound, snare drum, organ, vocal, it's bouncing off the ceiling, the floor, the walls, but it never bounces from one flat surface to another. The only straight flat surface is the ceiling. And that means you get this unbelievable reverb or echo. It's an amazing sound. I can tell the sound of a Stax record within a bar because of that studio. Then you put it together that all the same musicians are playing on all the same records. It had an amazingly unique sound for those years, 60 to maybe late 68, early 69. Magical sound.
Yeah, I mean, that's so much more than everything that you said there, some of which I've heard myself, and then some of it I've heard but not recognized it. It
Sure.
makes so much sense. You
And
you've
let's
made
face
it.
it, most listeners don't analyze while they're listening. They like
Hmm.
things or they don't. They dance to
Yeah.
things or they don't. They find it emotional or relatable or they don't. But those, all the things I just listed are part of what makes it so emotional, relatable for so many people who love that music.
Yeah, and you made a lot of comparisons to Motown musically. I'm curious socially, culturally, what differences we can draw between Stax and Motown and how they conducted themselves, because I know Berry Gordy had a very different approach with Motown than what we kind
Sure.
of see through the Stax documentary.
And again, for the sake of listeners, Motown essentially starts in 1960, same year as Stax. And although Motown still exists today, although none of the original people are involved in it, by the early 70s, Motown had moved from Detroit to LA and expanded and changed a lot of their sound. So in many ways, the two labels, Stax and Motown, one in Memphis, the other in Detroit, their histories very closely parallel each other from 1960 to the early and mid 70s. Then Stax goes bankrupt, Motown continues, but it continues with DeBarge, Rick James, Tina Marie, great records, great artists, but nothing related to what was the Motown sound in the 60s. And Motown had that sound because, like Stax, it had a house band that played on everything. And it was had a unique studio, very different one than Stax. It was the basement slash garage at the back of a house that had a very low ceiling. Every surface was perpendicular to another. Flat floor, no angles to the walls, very compressed because of that low ceiling. So when you make a sound, again, voice, drum, horn, guitar, whatever, it's a wave, right? Sounds are sound waves, and it goes in the air, hits a wall or a ceiling, bounces off it, and then it's the opposite wall or the floor, and it cancels out. So it's a much different sound. It doesn't have the same reverb feel. It's acoustically a whole other world. And it's fascinating because the Motown sound was great. When I compare Stax and Motown, I'm not putting Motown down. I'm a serious collector of Motown. And if there weren't already 8 books written when I started Stax, I probably would have written the Motown book too. Now there's probably 40 books on Motown. It's insane. It was more popular because it crossed over to a white audience. And that's partially in a much bigger way. And that's partially at the time. And it's partially because of Berry Gordy. Berry Gordy, who you mentioned, was the black owner of Motown. Berry Gordy came from a middle-class family where everybody was successful. That family was so successful that they made the cover and had a big spread in Ebony magazine before Motown was happening. They were considered the model, socially upward mobile Black family in America. So from the start of his life, Berry's grandfather and his father had both been massively successful in business and both expected all their children would be. Berry tried a few different things, tried boxing, tried a record store, both of which failed, and eventually started writing songs for Jackie Wilson, and then starting his own label. When he started his own label, he did research and design, just like a car company would in Detroit. He looked at what Black records crossed over to the pop records and what did they have that was different from Black records that didn't cross over to the pop records. And he literally made a list. And every Motown writer from the beginning, and Berry and Smokey Robinson were the first 2 writers, Berry would teach them what they needed to do to achieve success with Black people, but also to cross over and get pop success. Because Berry, middle class and aspiring, was about money. Wasn't good enough just to sell to Blacks. He wanted to sell to everybody and make that much more money. I can't argue with him or blame him. And I would never suggest that was somehow selling out, which a lot of people like to suggest. But I think that's a very racist notion of what Black music can be and what Black people can do. Stax, ironically, was started by a white country fiddler who was working class in the extreme, the opposite of Berry Gordy. And he started a label where he thought he was going to record country and pop because he loved country music and pop and didn't know much about Black music. His first 10 or so records, country and pop, all were failures in the late 50s. When he moved his studio to that abandoned movie theater I told you about, it was in a neighborhood that was quickly turning to become an all-Black neighborhood. So people in the neighborhood noticed there's this recording studio being, the theater's being turned into a recording studio, and talented musicians want to know what's up. How can they get involved? One of them was Rufus Thomas, who I mentioned earlier. He had had a huge hit 7, 8 years earlier at Sun Records, a record called Bearcat, answer record to Big Mama Thornton's Hound Dog. He was a DJ on WDIA, which was the Black appeal station in Memphis. He came knocking on the door and asked Jim Stewart if Jim might want to record him and his daughter, Carla, on a song called 'Cause I Love You. Jim heard it and thought, well, I keep failing with pop and country records, and this gentleman is a DJ, so I know he's going to get some radio play locally. Why not? 'Cause I Love You by Rufus and his daughter Carla Thomas becomes a regional hit, to the point where Atlantic Records up in New York, their distributor based out of Nashville, the Southern distributor, phones New York and says, this record's happening. Maybe you should distribute it. Atlantic makes a deal with Stax. Next big record's Gee Whiz by Carla Thomas solo, and with Atlantic's promotion and distribution all over the US and into Canada, it goes top 5. So Jim Stewart suddenly finds he's got an R&B label for a guy who knew nothing previously about R&B. I should mention, he's a partner with his sister, Estelle Axton. That's where Stax comes from. ST from Stewart, AX from Axton. but it still wasn't involved in the day-to-day records. She turned the candy counter of the movie theater into a record store to, have additional cash flow. They hired a guy named Al Bell, black disc jockey, in 1965. Al was an amazing man. And he thought he'd be great for a promotion because he knew the disc jockeys, black disc jockeys across the country. Al Bell was an amazing promotion man, but also got into marketing, and by 68 owned part of the company. By 69 co-owned the company. By 1972 totally owned the company. And Al Bell had expansionist visions. Well, Jim Stewart was content with the original Stax sound to the point where he once told an engineer who said, if we do the few things this, we can make it a pop record. Jim said, I don't care if I ever sell a goddamn record to a white person again. This is the Stax sound. He fell in love with it, and he engineered and produced all those Otis Redding records and tons of other black records in the 60s. Jim was the guy working the control board. But Al Bell thought bigger, and he eventually records jazz, pop, gospel, and so on. But he also opens the door for an artist like Isaac Hayes, who we spoke about earlier, who doesn't sing like Sam Moore, Sam and Dave, or Otis Redding, doesn't have that rasp. He croons, and he's big influenced by jazz and classical. So when he finally does that solo album, Hot Buttered Soul, he has an 18-minute song on it, a 12-minute song, a 9-minute song, and a 4-minute song. No black artist had done that before, except jazz artists. He also had massive string sections that were classically influenced and extremely dramatic. And he hired a black rock guitar player, Harold Bean, who would later play in Funkadelic, to do some of the solos. And 3 of the 4 songs were written by white pop songwriters. Isaac wrote the 4th. So you got this guy who was one of the greatest soul producers, session players, and writers ever, making a solo album with, yes, influence from soul, but also from pop, rock, classical, and jazz. And he really creates a whole new hybrid. And as I said before, changes the whole political economy of the black record industry. And of course, he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where he deserves to be, as is Jim Stewart, as is Sam and Dave, as is Otis Redding, as are the staple singers, all Stax artists.
It's so fascinating to see how those various social and cultural differences play into the creative aspect, not making either one of these, titans of industry of soul and R&B music lesser than the other, just different.
I should say one other thing about that. Think of Detroit, especially in the 60s when it was a booming city. It had, massive economy because of the car industry. Blacks and whites had jobs and decent paying jobs. The dream of buying your own home was a reality for anybody who was willing to work at a factory level there. That's, of course, no longer true and hasn't been true for a long time, but it was true then. Massive immigration from the South and Midwest to Detroit by Black and white people, a very dense, industrialized northern city, and with real cold winters. Stax is in Memphis. Memphis had a much smaller population, and with Memphis, land was never an issue. So as Memphis grew, they just kept building further away from the Mississippi River, further east. They don't have a downtown with skyscrapers. They have a few 8-story buildings, and they began to realize this is stupid. We don't need to build these multi-story buildings like they have in the north because we got land forever. So it's spread out. It feels like a small town, even though it's a big city, although not nearly as big as Detroit became. People walk slower, they talk slower, and they're not so driven by the thought in the 60s and early 70s, at least, of industrial capitalism. That meant people got paid by the song. If it took you 2 hours to record a song, great. If it took you a day and a half, same pay once you got the song down. and people didn't worry about it. Not at Detroit. Musicians Union made sure musicians got paid a set rate every 3 hours, which meant the record companies, this was true in New York and LA too, wanted 4 songs in 3 hours. To do that, they'd write out charts, write out sheet music, especially for horns and so on. And at Stax, nobody wrote out sheet music. They played by ear, creating head arrangements. And the difference is when you're reading music, somebody else has dictated your part. You're just paid to execute. When you're playing head arrangements, you got room to move a little bit. You don't have to play something that's a dot and a stroke on a page. You also can play in spaces, rhythmic places that aren't at the level of a quarter, an eighth, or a 16th note. You can play at micro little spaces that you feel. You can't think of through them consciously. They're too micro, but people who read music aren't going to play that way. Massive difference. And that has to do with human ecology, how dense people are in terms of living together. It has to do with climate. People walk quicker when it's cold, wear more clothes, and so on. And it has to do with drive. Not so driven if you're rural and southern, especially with that weather. And it took longer for capitalism to become massively influential, which it now is, of course. And capitalism existed. Jim Stewart wanted to make money, but he made a couple $1 million. That was enough. Berry Gordy was a product of the industrial north, where if you made 5 million this year, great, you better make 10 next year or you're failing. Very different mindsets. And that has a lot to do with the sound of the music.
That is incredibly fascinating. The documentary looks at the rise of Stax and the eventual conclusion of the label. To you, and with all that you have done with Stax, what is the enduring legacy of Stax?
Well, I think the legacy is, first of all, an incredible amount of amazing music, enough for 28 CDs of just the singles, and a dozen more CDs if you start checking out the albums. And all of them have been reissued, which is extraordinary. So that legacy lives on, but the legacy lives on in deeper ways. Hip hop artists have sampled Stax from the very, very beginning of hip hop, and it continues to this day. So crate diggers, DJs, they're finding more and more obscure Stax records and creating new hip hop records with them. So that sound lives on, and some of the listeners want to find out where the samples come from and eventually listen to the earlier music. Hip hop's been incredible for educating both Black and white young people about Black music history. So it lives on there. And there's bar bands all over, I'll say the world, but certainly the West, who are covering records like Dock of the Bay, Respect Yourself, Soul Man, Knock on Wood. Those are standards. And bars, weddings, bar mitzvahs. And a number of those covers have become hit records. Think of Salt and Pepper with En Vogue doing What a Man. That was totally based and sampled from an obscure Stax single by a woman named Linda Lindell, who only recorded 2 songs in her life and never sold any records. But she's on the second box set I did, and it was picked up by En Vogue and Salt and Pepper. It became a massive smash. It's in those ways that the legacy lives on. The museum that I was integral building, it's massively visited. It's one of the few museums that is able to sustain itself every year. Most museums need public support. It lives on in the Stax Academy of Music, which is a music school attached to the Stax Museum, where numerous Stax musicians come back and teach. And they teach about, of course, the music they made, but they teach about music in general and lots of other musicians who were never at Stax come teach there. It's an amazing program for young individuals who otherwise in Memphis might not have those chances. And it lives in things like this 4-hour documentary and my book, Soulsville U.S.A, the story of Stax Records. So it lives in lots of ways. That music will never die. And as long as people want to read, my book's there. And as long as we have documentaries, hopefully this video will be available in some format. Who knows what will occur after streaming, but hopefully it continues for many years and turns on many other generations.
Absolutely. Like I said, it is an incredible documentary. 4 episode series, just it's so insightful, it's so important, and the use of primary evidence is astounding. The one question that I close with every guest, um, if you had to pick 3 desert island records, which would you choose?
Stax Records or any records?
I think you're gonna be on here again later this year, so we can make this round easy and say Stax Records.
Okay, albums or singles?
Let's go albums.
No, I'm going to go singles.
Okay, okay.
And not, I mean, I could do albums. In fact, I'll do albums, but it's because partially it's also the singles that are on the albums.
Okay.
Otis Redding, The Dictionary of Soul, or Otis Blue, one of those two. Isaac Hayes, Hot Buttered Soul, or Shaft, one of those two. And the Staple Singers, Bealtitude, which has the incredible singles Respect Yourself and I'll Take You There. Any of those can be life-changing. And if I can really cheat, I'd say 3 box sets. I don't know if they count as an album, but the Stax Volt Singles 1959 to 68, Stax Volt Singles Volume 2, 68 to 71, and the Stax Volt Soul Singles Volume 3, 72 to 75. I admit I produced and/or wrote liner notes for all of them, but they will turn you on to so much incredible music, from Green Onions by Booker T and the MGs to Holy Ghost by the Barkays.
And if it wasn't clear by that, Rob Bowman loves Stax Records.
Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's been a pleasure.
You have a good day.
You as well.
Thank you for tuning in for my conversation with Rob Bowman. Stax, Soulsville U.S.A. is available now to stream on HBO and Crave. If you enjoyed our chat, stay tuned as I will be joined by Rob later this year to discuss his second documentary for 2024, Any Other Way, The Jackie Shane Story. Join me again in 2 weeks for another episode of Beats by Jer. I'm Jared Harris, and this is Beats by Jer.